Skin. Victoria Temple. This is part 6 of Sign of the Times series. I was sitting on a porch drinking lemonade. As I looked around, I noticed that the house was big. There were no other houses that I could see. There was a fancy garden and I could see fields of what appeared to be cotton. As I looked down at myself, I could see that I was wearing the most beautiful dress that I had ever seen. It was white with lace and a nice purple ribbon belt. At least the magic book now sent me to a place where I would not suffer too much. I figured that I was on some farm that was in the 19th century. I noticed a girl sitting next to me. She was talking and talking. She was a bit older than me, and wore a dress that was as beautiful as mine. Besides, I realized that she talked a lot. I also guessed she was my older sister. I also knew that she had a high opinion of herself. She seemed to like to talk about how pretty and talented she was. I was being polite and nodded as she boasted and thought that she was God's gift to humankind. I asked the black boy that was standing next to us if he did not want to sit down and eat some breakfast. This made my sister laugh and she slapped him across the face and asked why would a slave eat with us? They should eat with the animals. This made me mad. She slapped the boy that was doing his best to serve us. She was racist. He was black and that did not make him subhuman. He could be smarter than we were. She had no right to say what she did and she had no right to treat him the way she did. I wanted to console him and hug him. Then it hit me. The book transported me to a time in America when there were slaves. Black people were kidnapped from Africa and sold as slaves in America. These slaves were often treated worse than animals. The magic book had sent me to places where my life was often in danger and I was the victim. This time it would be harder. I would not be the victim. I would be the person that victimizes others. This would be impossible for me. I could not be dominant and boss people around. I was not racist. How would I survive here? When my sister slapped the boy, I told her that there was no need to do that. I tried to convince her that we had to respect everyone despite their color. This made my sister laugh and said that he was only a slave. When he was too slow or did something wrong, then the only thing that he understood was a slap. It also reminded him of his place in the world. I could feel the rage build inside me. I shouted at my sister that she should keep silent. Then a man who I guessed was our dad came towards us. He asked me if the heat was getting to me and if I felt sick. At any rate, he suggested that I rest inside today and not be out in the sun. I did what he said. I decided that I would do my best to avoid my sister. I did not like her at all. She was a racist and evil in the way she treated others. The thing was that I found out my whole family were this way. My mother just sat around painting or doing some creative things while she ordered the slaves to satisfy her smallest desire. She would also get mad at them if they did something wrong. I saw her throw a cup at one slave. This world seemed to be inhumane. It was scary and it was so wrong. There were several things that I noticed. While we were in pretty clothes made of the finest materials, the slave wore old dull clothes. They looked so tired and so afraid. It made me think that the slaves were once happy and proud people that had a good life in Africa. They were free and had their own traditions and customs. Now they lived here and were treated as animals. They were no longer free. They were my parents' property. My first day in this world was a day full of shocks. I was happy that night when it was time for me to go to bed. I could dream of my real family in 2020. I could dream of a time when there were colored children in my class. Some were smarter than me and they were great friends. I never thought of them having a different color than me. They were free and equal. This is the way that it should be. It turned out that I had my own slave. Her name was Alice. She did not say a word and always looked down. She was tidying and then told me that she would help me get dressed for bed. This surprised me a bit and was a bit embarrassed. I told Alice to sit on the chair. I did not need her help getting dressed. She looked terrified when I said this and asked if I was mad at her. I smiled and told her of course I was not. My sister came in and ordered Alice not to be lazy as she should be working. Then she looked at me and asked me what was wrong with me. She told me that I was being too soft and reminded me that I had to follow the rules, customs, and traditions of society. I had to have Southern pride. This meant I had my place in society and Alice had to know her place. If I let Alice think that she was more important than she was, then it would only be bad for both Alice and me. Alice would be punished and everyone would think that I was an abolitionist, which would bring shame to the family. I did not care what my sister thought. I knew that I was not a racist and I had no wish to be the owner of any other human being and did not think that because I was white, this made me better. Still, I knew that I came from 2020 and after a civil war in the USA and countless interracial tensions, most people thought in a different way. This was not the case in the 19th century. White people thought they were created in God's image and had the right to treat people that were not white as inferior. I had to see for myself. So the next day, I did not say a word to my parents or my sister. I did not show any anger when they treated a slave harshly. After breakfast, I told them that I wanted to take a walk. Dad told me to take Alice with me. When Alice and I were walking, I told her that I did not consider her my slave. I wanted her to be my friend. Alice did not trust me and did not know what to say. She was silent for a bit and then told me that she could not be my friend as that was not allowed. Alice was afraid of what would happen if others found out. I asked her to take me to the place where the slaves lived. So we walked through some fields where I could see slaves working with cotton. They were of all ages from very old people to small children. I could see that they were working very hard. They looked so sad and some looked afraid. They especially looked afraid when a man on a horse carrying a whip came close to them. If they were not working hard enough, they would get a lash with the whip. Alice explained he was the overseer and everyone was afraid of him. The slaves lived in small shacks. They were poorly built and very small. Alice showed me where her mother lived. She was out in the fields, but her grandmother was there. She was taking care of a small baby. Alice told me that she had 9 brothers and sisters and they all lived here. Alice had to sleep on the floor in my room so she missed them. I did not say anything as I was shocked. There was hardly any furniture in the shack. It looked so inhumane that I wondered should a dog even be kept in a place like this. The shack was smaller than my bedroom. How could 8 children and Alice's mother, father, and grandmother live here? At the same time, I could see that they had pride. They did their best to make it look like a home. From what Alice told me, what they lacked in material ways, the house was filled with love. As we were walking out of the shack, I saw my dad that was on his horse. He was not happy to have seen me. He ordered me to go back to the house. Later he wanted me to stand attention and want to know what I was doing in the slave camp. I tried to explain that I just wanted to see it. This got Dad mad and told me it was not a place for his child to be. Under no circumstances was I allowed to visit the slave camp again. I did not understand why, but I knew that it was very wrong of me to go there, as he was mad and Alice was punished. I wanted the magic book to take me from here as well as Alice. When I woke up, I was still in this world where my family owned humans. Alice was up and tidying my room. She was very quiet. I sat up in my bed and told her that I was sorry that I got her in trouble. She smiled and told me that she was grateful that I wanted to see how her kind lived and that we visited her family. It showed that I cared. Her gratitude nearly made me want to cry. I told her that I detest slavery and racism. Alice shrugged her shoulder and told me that there would be no slavery in heaven. While on earth, we had to live with other people's hatred and wish to dominate others. Dad was still mad at me, so I was told not to leave the house. This gave Mom a chance to speak with me. She said the same thing as others told me. I had to stop being a slave lover and stop shaming the family. There is a hierarchy in the world and a system of how the world works. I had to accept this and not try to change what should not be changed. I wanted to discuss this with her but decided that no one listened to me so far, so it would be pointless trying to discuss anything. After lunch, Dad came to the house and told me to come with him. He told me that it was time to learn about life on a plantation. So we walked to the slave camp. I was so confused. I got in trouble for visiting the slave camp before and now Dad was taking me there himself. Sometimes parents were so strange. I soon found out why he took me there. A slave was caught trying to run away. He was tied to a pole. I could see that he was not that old. He also had a lot of muscles. I am sure that he was the strongest man that I ever met. The overseer took a whip and started to whip him. When I tried to turn away, Dad held my head and forced me to look at the whipping. He repeated that it was time that I learned a lesson. The man was whipped again and again. The sound of every whip was like a screeching sound of death. I was horrified at its cruelty and was crying. When the whole thing was over, the slave fell to the ground. His back was covered with blood and he looked like a corpse. I was led back to the house. I ran to my room and just sat in a corner. I could understand why the slave wanted to run away. He wanted his freedom. However, he was considered property and would never have freedom. He was whipped as a punishment and a way to subdue him. In this cruel world, there seemed to be no hope. The white people could not see what they were doing was wrong. There was nothing that I could do about it. I could not sleep that night. I kept twisting and turning in my bed as I had nightmares about the whipping. I could not sleep. I imagined that it was the same for him. He must have been in so much pain. The next morning I snuck out of the house and breakfast and went to the slave camp. I did not want Alice to come as she would only get punished. Life in the camp stopped when I arrived at the camp. Everyone just looked at me and kept their distance. I found the shack where the runaway slave was in. He was laying on a wooden table while women were tending to his wounds. Some other women were singing some gospel songs and praying. Everyone stopped when they have seen me enter the room. An old lady was crying and asked what I was doing there. I felt as if all eyes were on me as they were waiting for an answer. I told them that I felt bad about the whipping and just wanted to help. There was silence. Alice's grandmother took my arm and said, "With all respect, miss, I think you should leave. This is a hard time for the man and his family. As you can see, he is very hurt and will always have these scars on his back as a reminder. While we appreciate that you want to help, you must realize we see you and your family as our owners. We see you as people that have us as property and can do with us as you wish. It was your family that ordered that he would be whipped until he was close to death." It was very brave of Alice's grandmother to say all of this. I could have her punished for speaking in that way. Yet what she said was true. My family was the cause of the suffering. I was an intruder. I quietly apologized for disturbing them and left. That night I was in my bedroom thinking about what I have seen. Dad came storming into my bedroom. He was very mad at me. My sister saw me sneaking out of the house and secretly followed me to the slave camp. She told Dad about this and now he was outraged. He told me that he was ashamed that his own daughter was just like a Yankee abolitionist. He did not want me to explain why I was at the camp or why I disobeyed him. He was tired of me and my excuses. When he was finished blowing steam, he told me that I would be locked in my room until further notice. Dad walked out and I could hear the door being locked. Alice was locked in my room with me, so one would think that I had company. I did not. She said nothing. This made me sad as it made me think that she still considered me an owner. I thought that she may have been afraid of me. I did not know how long I would be locked up. I sat on my bed and looked out the window. Why did the magic book send me here? There was nothing else I could do except make the life of others a life of hell. When would this magic book transport me home to the time period that I belonged to? Alice finally spoke. I do not understand you, miss. You want to be my friend. I am your slave, and this was hard for me to understand. Why would a white girl want to be friends with me? It has taken me some time, but I do see that you care about my people. I do see that you respect us as humans. Despite this, the fact is that I will always be your slave. We can be friends, but this would never stop me from being your slave, or my family being whipped and having to work until the hard work kills them. I did not know what to reply to this. Alice was right. The fact was that she would always be a slave, and I could not change this. The question was if she would have been here as a friend if she had the freedom to be where she wanted. I must have been locked up for several days. I did not see any of my family. Finally, my mother came in and told me that I was no longer locked up. She told me that she hoped that I had enough time to think about the errors of my ways. She pleaded that I stopped being friendly with slaves and think they were more important than they deserved. She reminded me that I was a lady. I would never get married or would survive in society if I had the same views as the Yankees that thought that slavery should be abolished. Things got back to normal. The slaves did what they were told and there were often punishments. My sister was as evil as she ever was. Dad hardly spoke with me as I must have been a thorn in his eye. I did my best to close my eyes whenever I saw any injustice. I just wanted the magic book to take me out of here and take me someplace else. One day, Alice and I were sitting in the fields. We were talking about nature and how pretty things were. I wanted to tell her about the magic book and what it was like to live in 2020. I wanted to give her hope that things would change. I refrained from telling her that. Everyone already thought I was crazy enough. Alice did confide in me about a secret she had. She told me that my dad has a relationship with her mother. The fact was that it was not a relationship as he just used her mother. The end result was that it ended with the birth of Alice. She may have a white father, but he would never acknowledge it and Alice would always be considered a slave. This shocked and confused me. I knew nothing about love and how adult relationships were, but I did understand how hard it was to be for Alice to know who her real dad was and he would not acknowledge her. The next day when I woke up, Alice was not there. I looked everywhere and could not find Alice. When I asked a slave where Alice was, I was told that Alice was no longer there. What happened to Alice? I did not believe that Alice was gone, so I searched everywhere I could. Alice was not to be found. I felt as if I would have an anxiety attack. She was my best friend and I was so worried about her. When I asked the slaves where she was, then they would just say that she was no longer there and look away with sad faces. It was my evil sister that finally told me what happened. She had an evil smile on her face as she told me that Alice was sold to another plantation. Then my sister looked me in the eye and said that I could only blame myself that Alice was sold. I found Dad and demanded to know why he sold Alice. Dad was surprised that I was asking in this way and not as a polite daughter should. Dad just looked at me and was quiet again. He most likely thought he would answer my question or get mad at me for being impolite. In the end, he told me that Alice had been sold. He considered her a bad influence on me. He did not want his daughter to be a slave-loving person. He had no choice but to sell Alice. My dad even complained that he did not get the money that she was worth. I was so shocked that I did not even respond. I ran to my room and cried. When my mom or sister wanted to come in, I told them to leave me alone. I felt so bad that Alice was sold. It seemed so inhumane that another human being could be a commodity that could be sold for cash. Should it not be up to Alice where she wanted to be? How could Dad force her away from her family and the only people that she knew? Alice was just a child and she would now be forced to live the life of an orphan. Dad was ashamed of me for being, as he called it, a slave lover. I was so ashamed of my family, that they would treat another human in this way. The worst thing was that Dad was her biological dad. He would never acknowledge this because Alice's mother was a slave. In reality, Dad sold his own daughter. How he could do this and live with it puzzled me. It showed how primitive this world was. I had to do something. Once again, I snuck down to the slave camp and found where Alice's family lived. I knew that they did not want me there. This was a selfish thing that I had to do. Alice's mother and grandmother were in the shack. I could see that Alice's mother had been crying. It must have devastated her that her daughter was sold. As a mother, she was most likely worried that she would never see her daughter again. It made me think of what my real mother was going through in 2020. Did she notice that I was gone? She would never know it was the magic book that was making me travel through time. She would be worried that something very bad had happened to me. I did not get a chance to speak with Alice's family. Dad barged into the shack and demanded to know what I was doing at the slave camp. He did not give me a chance to answer. He asked me how many times he told me not to come here. He then told me that I have used all his patience with me. He dragged me from the shack back to the house. All the time he was shouting about how ashamed he was and how I disgraced the family. He told me that he would now sort me out once and for all. When we got back, he locked me in my room once again. He warned me that I would be locked in the room until he was sure that I was not a slave lover. I told him to be prepared to keep me locked up for the rest of my life. There was no way that I would consider any slave as property or animal. There is no way I would ever treat anyone as inferior to me because of their skin color. I told my dad that it was fine that he was ashamed of me. The truth was that I was ashamed of my family. They did not have respect for other human beings, especially if they had the wrong skin color. Then I looked Dad in the eyes and asked him how he could not be ashamed of himself. I told him that I knew that Alice was his secret daughter. I knew that he had a relationship with a slave. I knew that it was not love. He just used the slave as a toy. He did not take responsibility for Alice and would not even admit that he was her father. I asked him to tell me if it was right that a father sold his own daughter. Dad went quiet and pale. Then he told me that this showed him that I knew nothing about how the world worked. He told me that Alice could never be his daughter. She was a mistake. She had black blood in her. I was never to mention her again and how she was born. Then he warned me that I would only be let out when I understood God's consent for slavery and the rightful place for slaves in society. I was once again imprisoned in my bedroom. This time Alice was not here to keep me company. This was my dad's way of keeping me out of sight. I was bored and it seemed as if time stood still. On top of the punishment of being locked in, Dad decided that I would only be fed bread and water once a day. I tried telling myself that this was not just a punishment, it was also a protest. I would stand by my beliefs and not give in to Dad's beliefs. I knew that the suffering I experienced was nothing compared to the punishment that the slaves experience every day. It seemed as if I was in that room for an eternity. I figured that I would be there for an eternity. This was not the case. Suddenly there was a lot of shouting outside the house. There were some gunshots and I could hear people shouting in pain. I knew that there was something wrong when a stone came through my window. I was afraid and sat in a corner of the room. I had no clue as to what was going on, and this made the situation even worse. I could hear the hell outside coming closer and closer to the house. My mom and sister came into my room. They were also afraid. My mom told me that the slaves were rioting, they already killed the overseer and my dad. My mom told us to say our prayers as our lives were also in danger. My sister asked me if I was proud of myself. She thought this was all my fault. I wanted to answer that you sow what you reap, but was too afraid to open my eyes. We heard more glass breaking. There were shouts outside that we should burn and go to hell. My mom started to panic. She cried that they were burning the house. There was no hope. If we tried to get out of the house, they would catch us and kill us. If we stayed in the house, then we would die as well. My room was soon filled with smoke. I could not breathe. The smoke burnt my lungs and made me cough so much that I was hurting all over. I was on the floor gasping for air. I could see that my mom and sister were just as bad as me. I could feel the life slowly draining from me. The smoke turned black and I felt the magic of the book working. I was once again teleported out of this world. I found myself standing in a graveyard. A coffin was being lowered into the ground. I wondered where the book sent me this time. To be continued in Sign of the Times Emerald Tears.